The Calraxian Empire had ruled the galaxy for 3,000 years, and their fleets had crushed more than 100 civilizations beneath their iron grip. When their scout ships detected the small blue world called Earth, spinning quietly in its corner of space, they expected another easy conquest like all the others that came before. Admiral Krevthar sat in his command throne aboard the massive warship Domination and dispatched his fastest messenger vessel to deliver humanity's ultimatum. The message was simple and had been delivered to countless species before: submit to Calraxian rule or be destroyed. There would be no negotiations and no mercy for those who refused. The messenger ship crossed through empty space toward the boundary that these primitive humans had dared to mark as their territory. Commander Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the TCS Defiant and watched the alien vessel approach through the viewport. The Calraxian ship was absolutely massive, and it dwarfed anything that Earth had ever constructed in its orbital shipyards. The hull was covered in scars from 1,000 battles, and each mark told the story of another civilization that had fallen before the Empire's might. Around Jake, his crew worked in tense silence as they monitored every sensor reading and weapon system. They all knew what was coming, and they had trained for this moment since the day they joined Terran Command. Lieutenant Amy Chen sat at her station with her fingers dancing across the holographic displays that showed the approaching vessel's speed and trajectory. The alien ship crossed the invisible line that humanity had drawn in space, and Amy's voice cut through the silence on the bridge. She reported that the Calraxian vessel had crossed the borderline and was continuing to advance toward Earth's defensive perimeter. Her voice was calm and professional despite the danger that filled the space around them. Jake looked at the display for a moment and then gave his first order. He told Amy to send the standard warning message that Terran Command had prepared for exactly this situation. The message would inform the aliens that Terran Command forbids any unauthorized vessels from crossing into human-controlled space and that they must turn back immediately. The translation computers aboard the Defiant worked quickly to convert the message into a format the aliens could understand and then broadcast it on all frequencies. The response came back within seconds, and the tone of it made every person on the bridge tense. The Calraxian messenger's reply dripped with contempt and arrogance. The message stated clearly that the Calraxian Empire did not recognize primitive territorial claims from species that had barely learned to leave their homeworld. They would take whatever they wished and go wherever they pleased, and no inferior species would tell them otherwise. The message ended with a threat that Earth would be punished for its insolence. Jake exchanged a long look with his second officer, Lieutenant Paul Harris, who stood beside the command chair. Both men had served together through the brutal unification wars when Earth's nations had finally stopped fighting each other and joined forces under one banner. They had seen combat in the asteroid belt and in the frozen wastes of Mars during the colony rebellions. They knew exactly what humanity was capable of when pushed into a corner, and they knew that Terran Command never made empty threats. The politicians back on Earth had debated for months about how to handle first contact with hostile alien forces, and the decision had been unanimous. The border was not negotiable under any circumstances, and there would be no exceptions to that rule. Amy's voice cut through Jake's thoughts as she reported that the Calraxian ship was powering up its weapon systems. The sensor displays showed energy building in the alien vessel's primary batteries, and it was clear they intended to make good on their threats. Weapons Officer Danny West spoke up next from his station near the front of the bridge. Danny was a former Marine who had survived the desperate battle for Mars Colony, when separatist forces had tried to break away from Earth's government. His voice was steady as he reported that he had a firing solution locked onto the alien vessel and was awaiting orders. The targeting computer had already calculated every possible trajectory, and the railgun batteries were charged and ready. Jake took a deep breath and felt the weight of the moment settle onto his shoulders. This was it. This was the moment when humanity would announce its presence to the galaxy in a way that could never be ignored or forgotten. Terran Command had been absolutely clear in their orders. The border was the border, and any vessel that crossed it without authorization would be met with immediate force. There would be one warning and one warning only. After that, the consequences would be swift and final. Jake's voice was quiet but firm as he gave the order that would change everything. He told Danny that he was authorized to fire. What happened in the next 3 seconds would be analyzed by military historians for generations to come. The Calraxian ship's defensive shields never even had time to activate, because their crew had never encountered weapons like the ones humanity had developed. The Defiance railgun batteries fired in perfect synchronization and sent solid slugs of depleted uranium and tungsten screaming through the void at a significant fraction of the speed of light. The projectiles carried enough kinetic energy to punch through the alien vessel's hull like it was made of thin paper. The Calraxian ship shuddered as the rounds tore through its interior, and then it split in two as secondary explosions ripped through the damaged sections. The ship's reactor containment failed a moment later, and the resulting explosion lit up the darkness of space with a brilliant flash that could be seen from Earth's orbital stations. Jake watched the debris field spread across his tactical display and then gave his next order. He told Amy to send a message to Calraxian space on all possible frequencies, and to make sure every word was translated perfectly. The message needed to be absolutely clear so there could be no misunderstanding about humanity's position. Amy worked quickly and then broadcast the message that would echo across the stars. The transmission stated that Terran Command forbids the Galactic Empire from crossing the border, and that any vessel that enters human space without proper authorization will be destroyed immediately. The message ended with a final warning that no further notices would be given and that the next ship to cross would meet the same fate. Lieutenant Harris stared at the expanding cloud of debris that had once been a Calraxian warship and asked the question that everyone on the bridge was thinking. He wanted to know if Jake thought the aliens would actually listen to the warning, or if they would come back with more ships. Jake's expression was grim as he considered the question and thought about everything he knew about galactic politics and military history. His answer was honest and direct. He said that the Calraxians probably would not listen, because species that had ruled for 3,000 years rarely learned lessons easily. But humanity had given them their chance and had followed every protocol that Terran Command had established. If the Empire chose to ignore the warning, then the blood would be on their hands and not humanity's. The bridge fell silent again as the crew processed what had just happened. They had just fired the first shots in what might become a war between Earth and a galactic empire. But they had also done something more important. They had drawn a line in space and defended it. They had shown that humanity would not bow down or beg for mercy from anyone. The border would hold because brave men and women were willing to stand on that line and say no further. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Admiral Krevthar received the news of his messenger ship's destruction while he sat in his private chambers reviewing battle plans for the conquest of the human system. The holographic display showed the final moments of the vessel as it was torn apart by weapons that the Calraxian sensors had barely detected before impact. His multiple eyes narrowed as he watched the recording again and again, trying to understand what had happened. In 3,000 years of galactic domination, no species had ever dared to attack a Calraxian vessel without provocation. These humans had not just attacked but had completely destroyed his ship in mere seconds. The Admiral's fury built inside him like a storm ready to break. He would teach these primitives the price of their arrogance and make an example of their world that would echo across the galaxy for generations. He immediately dispatched orders for a battle squadron to assemble and prepare for immediate deployment to human space. The force would consist of 12 warships, and each one was capable of reducing an entire continent to molten slag with its main batteries. The ships had fought in hundreds of campaigns, and their crews were veterans who had seen countless worlds burn. They would cross this arbitrary border that the humans had drawn and show them what real power looked like. There would be no negotiation and no mercy for a species foolish enough to challenge the Empire's authority. The squadron began moving toward human territory within hours of receiving their orders. At Terran Border Station, 17 Commander Lisa Grant sat in the command center and watched her sensor displays with careful attention. The station was not particularly impressive by galactic standards, but it served its purpose well. The cylindrical structure bristled with sensor arrays and weapon platforms that could track targets across millions of kilometers. Around the station, a small fleet of Earth vessels maintained their patrol routes in perfect formation. Lisa had commanded the station for 2 years and had trained her crew to handle any situation with calm efficiency. She knew that the destruction of the Calraxian messenger would not go unanswered, and had been expecting retaliation since the moment she received the report. Ensign Kevin Moore called out from his station that 12 hostile contacts had just appeared on long-range sensors. His voice carried a slight tremor, because this was his first real assignment after graduating from the academy 6 months earlier. He had trained in simulators and studied tactical doctrine, but this was real combat approaching, and the weight of it showed in his tone. Lisa glanced at the tactical display and saw the enemy formation moving steadily toward the border. The Calraxian ships were not attempting any evasive maneuvers or showing any caution whatsoever. They were coming straight at the border with the confidence of a predator that had never known defeat. Lisa ordered Kevin to broadcast the standard warning on all frequencies, just as Terran command protocols required. The message went out into space carrying the same words that had been sent to the first Calraxian ship. Terran command forbids unauthorized vessels from crossing the border, and any ships that violate human space will be destroyed. The response came back quickly, and it was exactly what Lisa had expected. The Calraxian admiral sent a message full of threats and declarations of superiority. He promised that his ships would crush the human defenders and then proceed to Earth, where they would teach humanity the proper respect for their galactic masters. The message ended with graphic descriptions of what would happen to Earth's population once the Empire took control. Lisa had served in the Pacific Defense Fleet during the brutal resource wars when nations fought over the last drops of oil and the final scraps of rare earth minerals. She had seen cities burn and watched good people die because someone had mistaken restraint for weakness. These aliens were about to learn the same hard lesson that humanity's enemies had learned during those dark years. She activated the fleet-wide communication channel and gave her orders in a voice that carried absolute authority. All vessels were to engage the enemy at maximum range and fire at will. There would be no hesitation and no second chances for ships that crossed the border. The Calraxian squadron continued its advance with complete confidence in their technological superiority. Their shields had withstood plasma weapons that could vaporize mountains in seconds. Their armor plating could endure direct hits from primitive nuclear weapons without significant damage. The crews had fought against species that possessed energy weapons far more advanced than anything these humans could possibly have developed. They feared nothing that Earth could throw at them and expected this battle to be over within minutes. The lead ship crossed the borderline and the others followed in tight formation. The first railgun salvo arrived before the Calraxian sensors even registered the launch. Solid projectiles of depleted uranium and tungsten alloy accelerated to velocities that approached a significant fraction of light speed. The physics involved were brutal and unforgiving. The kinetic energy carried by each round was enough to overcome any defensive shield that relied on deflecting energy weapons. The lead Calraxian ship's shields flickered briefly as they tried to disperse the impact force, but they were simply not designed to handle that much raw kinetic energy delivered in such a concentrated form. The shields failed completely and the rounds punched through the hull like bullets through cardboard. Missiles followed in the wake of the railgun barrage, and these were not the crude chemical rockets that the Calraxians expected from a primitive species. Each missile carried a fusion warhead with yields measured in megatons and guidance systems that could track and adjust for even relativistic effects. The weapons had been designed by engineers who assumed that any enemy humanity faced would have the same level of technology or better. The result was a weapons system that could overwhelm defenses through sheer precision and power. The void of space lit up with dozens of nuclear detonations as the missiles found their targets and released their devastating payloads. The battle lasted exactly 6 minutes from the first shot to the last. When the fighting ended, 8 Calraxian warships had been completely destroyed with their crews vaporized in the initial strikes. 2 more ships were crippled and drifting with massive hull breaches and failed reactor systems. The surviving 4 vessels broke formation in panic as their crews suddenly realized they were not facing primitive weapons at all. The ships turned and accelerated back across the border as fast as their engines could push them. Their shields were battered and their hulls showed scorch marks from near misses, but they had survived by pure chance. Lisa watched the enemy ships flee and made the decision to let them go. She could have ordered her fleet to pursue and finish them off, but that was not the mission. The goal was not to destroy every Calraxian ship, but to defend the border and send a clear message. She told Kevin to transmit their complete sensor logs directly to Calraxian space, using the communication frequencies that intelligence had provided. She wanted Admiral Krevthar to see exactly what had happened to his squadron. The young ensign worked quickly to compile the data, and then broadcast it on all known Calraxian military channels. Kevin looked up from his station with wide eyes and asked if Lisa thought this battle would actually stop the Empire from sending more ships? It was a fair question from someone who had never seen real combat before today. Lisa considered her answer carefully as she watched the tactical display update with post-battle damage reports. Her own fleet had suffered minor damage to 3 vessels, but nothing that would keep them out of action. She told Kevin that the Calraxians would probably not stop, because empires built on conquest do not give up easily. But this battle would make them think carefully before they tried again. Thinking was the first step toward understanding that Terran command did not make idle threats. When it came to defending the border, across human-controlled space, the word spread quickly about the victory at Border Station 17. Every ship captain and every station commander received updated tactical data, showing exactly how the battle had unfolded. The message was clear to everyone who wore the uniform of Terran command. The border would hold because humanity had the weapons and the will to defend it. More attacks would come and more battles would be fought, but Earth would not back down. The line had been drawn in space, and it would stay exactly where humanity had placed it. Emperor Thaxler of the Calraxian Empire sat upon his throne and watched the battle recordings for the 5th time in as many hours. His war council stood in uncomfortable silence around the holographic display as it showed human weapons tearing through the finest warships in the Imperial fleet with terrifying ease. The footage showed explosions and debris fields where proud vessels had been moments before. The Emperor's multiple eyes moved across each face of his assembled admirals and generals, looking for someone who could explain this disaster. These were the military leaders who had conquered entire sectors of space and subjugated dozens of civilizations. They had never known defeat until now. The Emperor's voice cut through the silence like a blade and demanded that Admiral Krevthar explain exactly how a species that had barely left their home system had managed to destroy 20 Imperial warships in 2 separate engagements. The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken threats. Krevthar stepped forward, and his body language showed the strain of the last few days. He began to explain that human weapons technology operated on principles that the Empire had not anticipated or prepared for. The humans favored kinetic projectiles and nuclear armaments over the energy weapons that dominated galactic warfare. Calraxian shields had been calibrated and designed to deflect plasma beams and particle weapons, because those were the tools that every other species used. No one had expected an intelligent species to perfect what the galaxy considered primitive technology. The Emperor rose from his throne, and his roar echoed through the chamber. He demanded to know why the shields could not simply be recalibrated to handle kinetic weapons if that was the problem. Krevthar explained that it was not a simple matter of adjustment. The amount of kinetic energy that human railguns delivered at near relativistic speeds exceeded what their shield technology could physically disperse. The laws of physics were absolute, and no amount of engineering could change the fundamental equations. To defend against human weapons would require completely redesigning their defensive systems from the ground up, and that would take years of research and development. The Empire had relied on their current technology for centuries, because it had always been enough. Now they faced an enemy that had made it obsolete. Meanwhile, far across space at Terran Command headquarters in Geneva, Admiral Helen Price stood before the Planetary Security Council and presented her strategic assessment. Behind her, massive holographic displays showed the complete disposition of human forces along the border. It was a thin line of ships and stations protecting humanity's claimed territory against an empire that could field thousands of vessels. The council members sat in their seats and listened with grave attention as Helen laid out the situation. She stated clearly that the Calraxians would return with a much larger force. Intelligence reports indicated that the Empire was assembling a fleet that would dwarf their previous attempts to cross the border. Humanity needed to make a critical decision about how to respond. Council Chairman Marcus Lee leaned forward in his seat and asked Helen for her professional recommendation. The question carried weight because everyone in the room knew that Helen had fought in every major conflict that humanity had faced over the past 30 years. She had been there when the first colony ships left Earth's orbit, carrying thousands of people to new worlds. She had commanded forces during the Unification Wars when Earth's nations finally stopped fighting each other. She had seen humanity discover that they were not alone in the universe, and that the galaxy was far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. Helen's answer was direct and uncompromising. She told the council that humanity must hold the line without wavering, The border had been established for very specific reasons, and those reasons remained valid. If Earth showed any weakness now or tried to negotiate some kind of compromise, then every other power in the galaxy would see humans as prey. The strong survived in galactic politics, and the weak were consumed. There was no middle ground. Counselor Patricia Hill spoke up and pointed out the obvious problem with that strategy. The Calraxians possessed thousands of warships while humanity could barely field a few hundred. How could such a small force possibly hold against those numbers? Helen smiled grimly and explained that warfare was not simply a matter of counting ships. Quality mattered more than quantity when the technology gap was significant enough. Human forces had now seen Calraxian technology in action, and it was sophisticated but ultimately predictable. The Empire relied heavily on shields and energy weapons because those tools had worked for 3,000 years. They had never faced an enemy that used the same weapons humans did. Earth built its arsenal to fight enemies who possessed the same technology that they had. Every weapon system was designed assuming the target would have comparable defenses. That made human military doctrine far more lethal than the Calraxians realized. The Security Council debated for 3 hours before finally taking a vote. The decision was unanimous. The border would hold regardless of what force the Empire sent against it. Terran Command began immediate preparations for what intelligence called the largest military operation in Calraxian history. Every available ship was recalled to defensive positions. Weapon stockpiles were distributed to forward stations. Crews drilled constantly on combat procedures. Humanity prepared for war. 6 weeks passed while the Calraxian Grand Fleet assembled in deep space far beyond human sensor range. When the Armada finally began its approach toward the border, the numbers were staggering. 300 warships, including a dozen of the massive Titan-class dreadnoughts that served as mobile fortresses. This was the fleet that had broken the will of civilizations and reduced proud species to vassal states. The formation stretched across space like a wall of metal and firepower. The crews aboard those ships believed absolutely in their inevitable victory. They were about to teach humanity the price of defying the Empire. Captain Ryan Foster stood on the bridge of the TCS Valiant, which served as the flagship of Battle Group 7. His force consisted of exactly 36 vessels arranged in defensive formation directly in the path of the approaching Calraxian fleet. The odds were 10 to 1 against them, and every person on every human ship knew it. Ryan looked at those numbers and felt no fear, because mathematics only told part of any story. Wars were won by courage and determination as much as by technology and tactics. His crew had trained for this moment, and they were ready. Ryan gave the order for all ships to go to battle stations, and the Valiant hummed with activity as systems powered up to combat readiness. He told his fleet to hold formation and wait for the enemy to commit fully to their attack. The key to defeating a numerically superior force was to make them fight on your terms, not theirs. The Calraxian fleet crossed the border in a massive wave with their shields active and weapons charged. They came forward with absolute confidence that their numbers would overwhelm any resistance. Ryan watched them advance, until they were too far into human space to retreat, quickly, and then he spoke one word. Into the fleet communication channel. Engage the human ships moved with precision that came from months of constant drilling. The formation split into smaller groups that scattered in multiple directions, forcing the Calraxians to divide their attention. Railguns fired in carefully coordinated salvos, with each gun timed to hit the same target within microseconds of the others. The concentrated kinetic force shattered shields that were designed to handle sustained energy weapon fire, but not this kind of overwhelming physical impact. Missiles followed the railgun strikes and streaked through space in massive swarms. Each missile was independently guided and could adjust its course to track moving targets. The Calraxians had upgraded their shields after the previous battles, but physics remained physics. There were limits to what any defensive system could absorb. The battle raged for 4 brutal hours. Space filled with weapons fire and explosions as both sides poured everything they had into the fight. Human ships used their superior maneuverability to avoid the worst of the Calraxian return fire, while maintaining devastating offensive pressure. The Empire's crews fought bravely, but they were facing tactics and weapons they had no effective counter for. When the shooting finally stopped, 70 Calraxian vessels had been destroyed or disabled to the point of being combat ineffective. Battle Group 7 had lost 3 ships with 2 more heavily damaged but still operational. Ryan looked at the tactical display and saw the surviving Calraxian ships beginning to withdraw. He made no move to pursue them. The mission was to defend the border, not to chase the enemy across the galaxy. He opened a communication channel that broadcast on all frequencies that the Calraxians used and delivered one final message. Terran command forbids the Galactic Empire from crossing the border. This is your last warning. There would be no more chances and no more mercy for those who ignored it. Emperor Thaxilor stared at the casualty report spread across his desk and felt something his species rarely experienced. The sensation was uncomfortable and foreign, but humans would have recognized it immediately as shock mixed with the first stirrings of fear. His empire had ruled the galaxy through overwhelming military force for 3,000 years. They had never encountered an enemy who could match them in ship-to-ship combat, and certainly never one who could defeat them so decisively with such vastly inferior numbers. The mathematics of the battle made no sense according to everything the Calraxians understood about warfare. 70 ships destroyed against only 3 enemy vessels lost. It was the kind of ratio that should have been impossible. Summoned General Vexmora, who served as the Empire's chief military strategist and had personally planned the successful conquest of 17 star systems. The general entered the throne room and bowed low before approaching the Emperor's desk. Thaxilor demanded an explanation for how this outcome was even possible. He wanted to understand what made these humans so dangerous when they possessed neither the numbers nor the apparent technological sophistication of the Empire. Vexmora activated a portable holographic display and began manipulating the images to show recordings of human combat doctrine in action. The general explained carefully that humans fought in ways completely unlike any species the Empire had ever encountered. They did not attempt to overpower their enemies with superior technology or greater numbers. Instead, they had taken weapons that the galaxy considered primitive and ancient, then perfected them to a degree that made them absolutely lethal. The humans had spent their entire history fighting each other in increasingly destructive wars. They understood violence and warfare at a fundamental level that peaceful species could never match. Every weapon they built was designed with the assumption that their enemy would have equal or better defensive capabilities. Emperor Thaxilor interrupted and dismissed the idea that kinetic weapons and nuclear devices could be considered advanced technology. These were ancient tools that most civilizations abandoned thousands of years ago in favor of energy weapons and particle beams. Vexmora nodded in acknowledgement but continued his explanation. He highlighted one of the human railguns in the holographic display and zoomed in to show its internal mechanisms. A single projectile fired from that weapon at 90% of light speed carried enough kinetic energy to completely destroy one of the Empire's dreadnoughts. The humans could fire dozens of such rounds every minute from each gun. Their warships carried multiple railgun batteries. The amount of kinetic force they could deliver in a sustained engagement was simply staggering. The general went on to explain that Calraxian shields had never been designed to handle that much physical impact. Energy weapons could be deflected or absorbed by creating electromagnetic fields and exotic matter barriers. Kinetic projectiles at relativistic speeds had to be stopped by physically absorbing their momentum, and the energy transfer involved was beyond what their shield generators could handle. The shields would fail after only a few hits, and then the projectiles would tear through hull armor that was meant to resist energy weapons, not solid matter traveling at near light speed. The Empire's entire defensive doctrine had been rendered obsolete by an enemy that had approached the problem from a completely different direction. Emperor Thaxilor sat back in his throne and his expression shifted from rage to something that might have been respect. He asked Vexmora what he recommended for the Empire's next move. The general's answer was blunt and honest. The Empire should seek diplomatic relations with humanity and recognize their territorial claims. Any further military action would result in even greater losses without any realistic chance of victory. The humans had proven they could defend their space, and more importantly, they had demonstrated the will to do so regardless of the odds. That combination of capability and determination made them far too dangerous to fight. At Terran Command Headquarters, Admiral Helen Price convened a meeting with her senior staff to discuss the changing situation. Captain Jake Morrison attended after his recent promotion and reassignment to strategic planning. Also present was Dr. Alan Carter, who headed the Office of Xenological Studies and had spent the last 2 months analyzing everything humanity had learned about Calraxian culture and psychology. Helen began the meeting by noting that intelligence reports showed the Calraxians had stopped all military probing along the border. Their fleet had withdrawn to defensive positions and showed no signs of preparing another offensive. The question was whether this represented a permanent change or just a temporary pause while they regrouped. Jake asked the obvious question of whether the Empire would attempt another invasion. Alan pulled up his cultural analysis reports and began explaining what he had learned about Calraxian society. The Empire valued strength above all other qualities. Their entire civilization was built on the concept that the strong had the right to rule over the weak. Humanity had now demonstrated superior strength in the only way the Calraxians truly understood, which was direct military confrontation. They might not like the outcome, but they would respect it because respect for power was deeply embedded in their culture. Another attack was possible, but increasingly unlikely as time passed and they had more opportunity to analyze their defeats. Helen considered this information carefully and then stated that humanity had effectively bought itself time and breathing room. Earth was no longer the unknown primitive species that could be easily conquered. They were now the civilization that had stood against the Calraxian Empire and won. Jake pointed out that the galaxy contained many other species and powers beyond just the Calraxians. What would be the reaction of these other civilizations to humanity's victories? Alan smiled and explained that every species with a space fleet had undoubtedly obtained recordings of the battles by now. Some would want to test humanity's defenses for themselves. Others would seek to establish friendly relations and trade agreements. Either way, Terran Command had announced Earth's position in galactic politics in the clearest possible terms. Human borders were not negotiable under any circumstances. 3 months after the Great Battle, a Calraxian diplomatic vessel appeared at the border and requested permission to cross into human-controlled space. This time the procedures were completely different from the arrogant demands that had preceded the war. The Calraxian ship transmitted proper recognition codes and followed all the protocols that Terran Command had established. They waited patiently for authorization rather than simply forcing their way across. Commander Lisa Grant, who now oversaw all diplomatic traffic at Border Station 17, reviewed the request carefully before granting permission. She assigned 2 escort vessels to accompany the diplomatic ship to Earth. The Calraxian ambassador who came aboard the station was a different individual from the military officers who had delivered threats before the fighting. His bearing and manner suggested someone who had learned hard lessons and taken them to heart. He spoke through translation software, and his first words were a request to establish formal diplomatic relations between the Empire and humanity. The Emperor wished to recognize Terran sovereignty over all territories humanity had claimed. There would be no further challenges to the border and no attempts to interfere with human expansion into unclaimed regions of space. Lisa listened carefully, and then responded with words that had been carefully prepared by diplomats back on Earth. Terran Command accepted the recognition of human sovereignty, but the Empire needed to understand one critical point. The borders were not simply lines drawn on star charts. They represented humanity's absolute determination to remain free and independent. Any future violations would be met with the same level of force that had been demonstrated in the previous battles. There would be no warnings and no second chances. The ambassador inclined his head in what appeared to be a gesture of respect among his species. He stated that the Calraxian Empire did not forget lessons learned through blood and fire. Perhaps there was much that both civilizations could teach each other, now that the question of relative strength had been settled. Lisa agreed that teaching and learning required mutual respect as the foundation. The Empire had learned through direct experience that respect could not be demanded or taken by force. It had to be earned through strength of arms and clarity of purpose. The ambassador acknowledged this truth and suggested that the galaxy might benefit from having humanity as an active participant in interstellar affairs. There were other threats and other challenges that neither species could face alone. Lisa said that humanity would consider such proposals carefully, but Earth's independence would never be compromised. Regardless of what alliances might be formed in the future, the meeting ended, with both sides understanding exactly where they stood. The war was over not because either side had been completely destroyed, but because the Calraxians had finally accepted that humanity could not be conquered. The border would remain exactly where Terran Command had drawn it. Ships would cross that border only with proper authorization, and only after following correct procedures. The age of Calraxian dominance over the entire galaxy had ended and a new era was beginning. It was an era where humanity would play a role that no one, including humans themselves, had anticipated. 6 months had passed since the last battle between humanity and the Calraxian Empire, and the entire galactic landscape had transformed in ways that no one could have predicted. The border incident had sent shockwaves through civilizations that had existed for thousands of years and had thought they understood how power worked in the galaxy. On dozens of worlds, military, strategists, and political leaders gathered in conference rooms to study the battle, recordings, and try to comprehend how such a young species had achieved such decisive victories against an empire that had seemed invincible. The recordings were analyzed frame by frame, and every weapon discharge was measured and catalogued. The conclusion was always the same. Humanity possessed military capabilities that exceeded their apparent technological level by a significant margin. At the Galactic Commerce Hub on Cyrax Prime, hundreds of traders and diplomats from across known space gathered in the massive station that served as neutral ground for interstellar negotiations. The humans had recently established an embassy there, and the building was modest compared to the towering structures maintained by older civilizations. But the staff who worked inside that embassy carried themselves with a quiet confidence that commanded respect. Ambassador Laura Bennett represented Earth's interest in these diplomatic gatherings. She had formerly served as a colonel in the Terran strategic forces and had commanded ground troops during the Unification Wars. Her military background gave her insights into power dynamics that purely civilian diplomats sometimes lacked. Laura sat at a large conference table surrounded by representatives from 6 major galactic powers. The Calraxian Empire had sent a new diplomatic envoy named Krenval, who had replaced their previous ambassador after the battles. The change in personnel reflected a change in attitude. The Velith delegate was a crystalline being whose species controlled several important trade routes that connected different regions of the galaxy. There were also representatives from the Torvan Collective and the Zephrite Union, along with observers from half a dozen smaller civilizations. The topic under discussion was how humanity would fit into the existing structure of galactic politics and commerce. The Velith delegate spoke first, and its translated voice came through the communication devices clearly. It stated that the gathering needed to address the question of where humanity belonged in the established order that had governed the galaxy for generations. Laura smiled politely and responded with words that had been carefully chosen to convey Earth's position without unnecessary hostility. She explained that humanity was not asking permission to fit into any existing structure. Terran Command had established clear boundaries around HFY man-controlled space. Earth was willing to engage in trade and diplomatic relations. Humanity would cooperate on matters of mutual interest with any civilization that approached them with respect. But human sovereignty was not subject to negotiation or compromise under any circumstances. The Calraxian ambassador, Krenval, spoke next, and his tone carried none of the arrogance that had characterized earlier communications from the Empire. He stated simply that the Calraxian Empire acknowledged humanity's capability to defend their territorial claims. The Empire recognized Earth's right to establish and maintain borders as they saw fit. It was as close to an apology as the Calraxians would ever offer. The statement represented a fundamental shift in how the Empire viewed humanity. Humans were no longer seen as primitives to be conquered, but as equals, who had earned their place through strength of arms. Back at Terran Command Headquarters, Admiral Helen Price reviewed status reports from every sector of human-controlled space. The fleet continued to grow as new vessels completed construction in the orbital shipyards that circled Earth and Mars and the outer colonies. But more important than raw numbers was the refinement of military doctrine based on lessons learned from actual combat. Engineers studied the battle data and made improvements to weapon systems. Tacticians developed new strategies for engaging numerically superior forces. Every branch of the military trained constantly to maintain the edge that had won them victory. Commodore Ryan Foster entered Helen's office carrying a data pad with the latest intelligence summaries. Ryan reported that the Xyloth Confederacy had formally requested permission to transit through human space. Their trade convoys needed to reach the Prandix cluster, and traveling through Earth's territory would reduce their journey time by nearly 3 weeks. The Confederacy was offering substantial payment for transit rights and had agreed to follow all Terran protocols. Helen asked Ryan for his professional assessment of the situation. Ryan explained that the Xyloth appeared to be genuinely interested in establishing normal trade relations rather than testing human defenses. Their diplomatic communications had been respectful, and they had followed proper procedures for making their request. Intelligence had no indication of hostile intent. Helen made her decision quickly. She told Ryan to grant the transit permission, but with specific conditions. Terran vessels would escort all Xyloth convoys while they traveled through human space. The escorts would be professional and courteous, but they would also be armed and watchful. Humanity had proven they could defend themselves when necessary. Now they needed to demonstrate that they could also be reasonable partners in peaceful endeavors. The balance between strength and cooperation would define how the rest of the galaxy viewed Earth in the years to come. On Earth itself, in a classroom in Chicago, a teacher named Susan Wright was explaining recent historical events to her students. The curriculum had been updated to include humanity's first major contact with galactic civilization and the conflicts that had resulted. Maps showed the borders that Terran Command had established and defended. Video recordings showed glimpses of the battles, though the most graphic footage was reserved for older students. Susan stood in front of her class of teenagers and tried to help them understand the significance of what had happened. She explained that the galaxy operated on principles of power and respect. Species that could defend themselves were treated as equals. Those who could not were either conquered or forced into subordinate positions. Humanity had demonstrated both the capability and the willingness to defend their territory against any threat. The military had not sought conflict, but when challenges came, they had responded with overwhelming force. That was not aggression. That was self-determination. A student raised her hand and asked whether there would be more wars in the future. Susan considered the question carefully before answering honestly. She told her students that more conflicts were certainly possible because the galaxy was vast and full of different civilizations with different values and goals. But now those civilizations understood that humanity would not submit to domination. Earth was not looking for enemies, but they were also not looking for masters. At the border, Commander Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the TCS Defiant conducting another routine patrol along the boundary that had been bought with blood and courage. The stars around him shone with the same ancient light they had always shone. But now humans knew that many of those distant suns sheltered civilizations that watched Earth with new understanding. Lieutenant Amy Chen called out from her sensor station that she had detected a Calraxian patrol vessel. The alien ship was maintaining position on their side of the border and keeping proper distance according to the protocols that had been established. Jake told Amy to open a communication channel. He spoke clearly, and his words were transmitted to the Calraxian ship. He identified his vessel and stated that he had observed their adherence to border protocols. He noted that their professional conduct was appreciated. The response came back within seconds. The Calraxian commander identified his ship and acknowledged the human presence. He expressed hope that both patrols would have quiet and uneventful shifts. It was a small exchange and brief, but it carried enormous symbolic weight. Two species that had fought a savage war only months earlier were now exchanging professional courtesies across a border that both sides respected. Jake turned away from the communication station and looked out at the stars. Lieutenant Paul Harris stood nearby and commented quietly that this was what they had fought for. Not conquest or glory, but simply the right to exist on their own terms. Jake agreed completely. The border represented more than just a line drawn in space. It represented humanity's declaration that they would determine their own fate. No empire would rule Earth. No alien power would dictate terms to humanity. The species that had climbed up from caves and built cities and eventually reached for the stars would bow to no one. Across all of human-controlled space, from the massive shipyards orbiting Luna to the growing colonies around Alpha Centauri, the message was clear and unwavering. From the military academies that trained the next generation of defenders to the diplomatic corps that negotiated humanity's relationships with other species, everyone understood what had been accomplished. Terran Command had forbidden the Galactic Empire from crossing the border, and the border had held firm. It had held not through aggression or territorial ambition, but through absolute determination that humanity would defend what was rightfully theirs. It had held through the courage of men and women who stood their ground when threatened. It had held because Earth had learned long ago that freedom had a price and that price must be paid when the bill came due. The galaxy now had a new power to contend with among its ancient civilizations. Humanity was not the oldest species or the most technologically advanced. They did not control the largest territory or command the biggest fleets, but they had proven themselves to be perhaps the most determined and certainly the most unwilling to compromise when it came to their fundamental independence. Earth had entered the galactic stage as equals, who earned their position through strength and resolve and absolute clarity of purpose. The border held because brave people made it hold, and it would continue to hold for as long as humans remembered what freedom meant and remained willing to defend it.